straight talk. I'm eager to hear what they have to say, so I'll turn it over to our moderator, Rich Rubin, the U.S. tax policy reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks to JCT for having me here, and thanks to everyone who's in the room for coming. I see a lot of former JCT staff, former Hill staff, people from around town, so it's a good crowd here, and I'm sure there's some folks watching on the live stream too. We've got a really good panel this afternoon with, I think, 5 very different perspectives on the Joint Committee on Taxation, so we'll hear a lot about history, we'll hear about economics, we'll hear a political perspective, we'll hear sort of lobbying and staff perspective, and we'll hear the kind of outside public and press perspective on the Joint Committee. So to join us, and we've got, starting right here, we've got Chairman Dave, former JCT Chairman, former Ways and Means Chairman Dave Camp, Alan Auerbach, Professor Emeritus from the University of California, Ajay Mehrotra, Professor of Law and History at Northwestern, John Talisman, who's had, as he will tell you, has had 16 different jobs, all like circling around JCT, and can talk about that, and is now at Capital Tax Partners, and then David Wessel, who was at the Wall Street Journal and is now at the Brookings Institution. So we're gonna, each presenter has their own remarks they'll make. I'll ask them some questions after that, and then we will have time for audience questions toward the end. So please think of those and enjoy the panel. Chairman Camp.
Well, thank you, Richard, and it's great to see so many distinguished guests here today, and thank you for the invitation to join in the celebration of JCT's 100th anniversary. As Tom mentioned, the Joint Committee on Taxation was created by the Revenue Act of 1926, signed into law by President Calvin Coolidge. So with increasing economic complexities, as well as a more complex tax system, the U.S. Congress recognized the need for nonpartisan expertise by creating the Joint Committee on Taxation. As a side note, the legislation creating the Joint Tax Committee also had a few public policy priorities, including ending public access to federal tax returns, increasing the corporate income tax rate to 13.5%, reducing the estate tax, eliminating the gift tax, and reducing personal income tax rates. So don't these issues sound familiar? As Yogi Berra would say, deja vu all over again. So today we're here to recognize a century of service, a century of integrity, and a century of behind-the-scenes work that has shaped American tax policy since 1926. I started my career in Congress as a staff member during the '86 Tax Reform Act, and then was the most junior member on Ways and Means, in the minority in the early '90s, and then ranking member and then chairman, as well as chairman of JCT. And I've seen firsthand the excellent quantitative work that goes into advising Congress, and especially the House Ways and Means and Senate Finance Committees on tax policy. And despite operating in a partisan environment, the Congress of the United States, the JCT has stood as a hallmark of nonpartisan expertise. Since its creation, the responsibilities of the Joint Committee have expanded significantly beyond the official scorekeeper role, and over the past 100 years, they've become increasingly involved in every step of the legislative process, including preparing the Blue Book, the essential guide to the American tax system. So just think about the scope of that responsibility. I came to especially appreciate that responsibility when I began a tax reform effort in 2009 as ranking member of Ways and Means. And over the next several years, the effort to conduct the first tax reform in a generation since the '86 Act was a daunting task. The work, of course, fell on the Ways and Means staff, the members, and heavily on the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation. So much of the work that goes into quantitative analysis is a grind. And I know how much effort the JCT staff put into that work over the years. And note to self, if one provision of a comprehensive tax bill changes, the entire bill has to be scored again, and that takes time. Tax provisions are interactive, lending incredible complexity to JCT's work. So the valuable public service JCT performs, much of it out of the public eye, is too often thankless, but not today. It's an honor to be part of recognizing the quiet, effective work of so many unsung heroes at JCT. They've dedicated themselves to giving the best information and analysis to the tax writing committees. members of Congress, and the public. It's easy to think of the big tax reform efforts, especially in the last few years, TCJA, BBB, IRA, and OB3. But there are many less well-known but important pieces of legislation as well. I can think of a couple of bills I worked on, the Adoption Tax Credit and the Adoption and Safe Families Act. So as we look at the next 100 years, the work of the Joint Committee on Taxation is more important than ever. The institutional memory, the analysis, the revenue estimates, and legal expertise to tell us what tax policy might do, what it will cost, and who it will affect, even when the revenue score goes from plus 35 billion to minus 50 billion, although that never quite actually happened to me. But the need for accurate, nonpartisan analysis is critical to the legislative process. Ensuring, as JCT has done for 100 years, that tax policy makers have straightforward, unbiased, and transparent analysis of tax policy has been and will continue to be their mission. And I want to acknowledge the chiefs of staff of the Joint Committee during my time in Congress: Hank Gutman, Ken Keyes, Lindy Paul, George Yin, Ed Kleinbard, and Tom Barthold. And Tom, I have to say that when it comes to JCT leadership, you are the GOAT, greatest of all time. Not only did you advise and oversee the Super Bowls of tax with TCJA and OB3, but also on numerous major and minor pieces of tax legislation during your time at JCT. And my current employer has several links to JCT. In fact, I'm not sure much client work is getting done right now because I see many of my colleagues here today. But I knew and respected Lindy at JCT, but also was able to work with her in PwC's Washington National Tax Services when I first left Congress. And also one of the founders of WNTS, Bobby Shapiro, and I overlapped during my tenure there, as well as the current leader of Washington National Tax Services, Kevin Levinson, Kevin was at JCT when I was working on HR1, that draft. And there are many others here. I see Brian Meehan, Carl Russo, Anita Asher's here, and I'm probably missing a few of my colleagues, but I really am really appreciative of all the work they do on behalf of the tax policy issues. And JCT has just gained someone else from our office, Noha Nairi, who is one of our exceptional individuals who's now joined JCT for a time. So in closing, the trust members of Congress and the public have in JCT has not been built overnight, but over a century of dedicated service and objective analysis. One of the committee's great strengths has been its consistent commitment to nonpartisanship. Even in times of vigorous policy debates, the Joint Committee on Taxation has delivered reliable, data-driven information supporting informed legislative decisions. The dedication of its staff, comprising leading economists, legal experts, and public servants, has been pivotal in shaping laws that impact every American. And while marking this centennial, we should both recognize the committee's achievements and reaffirm its core values of integrity, impartiality, and public service. These principles remain as essential today as they were a century ago, guiding us as we address future challenges in an ever-changing environment. Let us extend our sincere appreciation to the countless individuals whose commitment and professionalism have built the committee's enduring legacy. Their efforts have ensured that tax policy is grounded in meticulous analysis and bipartisan cooperation. So again, looking ahead, let us renew our pledge to these ideals as we work to strengthen a tax system that is fair, efficient, and responsive to the evolving needs of our nation. So congratulations to the Joint Committee on Taxation on reaching this remarkable centennial. May its next century be distinguished by continued excellence and exemplary service to Congress and the American people. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Camp. Professor Moroster is now going to take us basically from the creation of JCT in 1926 right up until when Chairman Camp was a young staffer.
Great. Well, thank you. As my slides are getting loaded, let me echo Chairman Camp in thanking Tom and everyone at JCT and the U.S. Congressional Historical Society, everyone involved has been for this great opportunity, for inviting me. Tom has invited me to a couple of events in the past. He says it's always nice to have a historian's perspective, a historical perspective on everything, and so I said, sure, I'd be happy to help. When he first contacted me, though, he said, you know, it's the 100th celebration, so can you do a century of JCT history in, I don't know, 15 minutes? And I said, well, I don't think I can do that, but maybe I can get about 50 or 60 years, some of the highlights that have occurred over time. But he did also stress that he did not want just a celebratory presentation of the history, but all of it, warts and all, I think is as he put it. And so I'm going to try to be a little provocative, I think, if I can get going here. Yeah, so you can see that I'm trying to talk about a little bit about change over time, right? The early watchdog functions to this more technical expertise. But let me get to the broad themes. Before we get to the really big details, let me cut to the chase about what I think we see in the JCT's history over its 50, 60 plus years. One are, of course, threads of historical continuity. Historians often talk about elements that are the same, and there are several elements that we can see that have been there from the very beginning. But we also see change. Change over time, incremental change over time, I would suggest. There are no real radical ruptures as far as I can tell in the history. But when we take a closer look at the threads, we see that there's generally sort of two countervailing forces, or at least we try to think that. I have a question mark there because I think it's kind of an open question. There's always been, from the very beginning, this need for technical, nonpartisan, and I'm going to question the nonpartisan part about all this, expertise. And because it's a congressional part of our political system, there is the power of partisan politics. That will always be there. But yet we see change over time. We see that, let's see if we can get a little, in the origins, we see both of these two forces. The need for technical expertise, as I'll show, as well as partisan politics. And then the early years, the Colin Stam years, I'll call them, we see a slight tilt towards the politics side of the spectrum. And then in the post-World War period, when we move from Stam and Doughton to the next chief of the committee, who is the big Larry Woodworth is the name I think many of you know, along with Wilbur Mills, I think we see a greater focus on expertise. But the big takeaway really is that this is not a simple story about linear progress. We like to think that expertise everywhere and always kinds of dominates, and I'm not sure that's accurate historically. It's a kind of noble dream that science is linear and always improving, but I think politics is always there, and I want to suggest that the shift is really more of a pendulum swing back and forth, and then we do move towards, I think, what I would call a more pragmatic view of bipartisan lawmaking, putting away the noble dream of pure objectivity to suggest that we need to get the ideas out there and then see which ones win out in the end. So I've divided it up into these 3 or 4 periods. I've bracketed the 86 Act because I know Rich Rubin's going to give me the hook before my 20 minutes, and so I know there's probably people in this room who know a lot more about the 86 Act than I do, but I do want to go through the origins and the Colin Stam and Larry Woodworth years. And so usually when I give a talk as a historian, I've got to remind people why taxes matter. I don't have to do that with this audience, of course. This is a group of tax experts. Alan and I are talking, this is sort of tax nerd nirvana. It's great to have so many great tax experts in the room, but this is an important aphorism that Justice Holmes had. It's on the IRS building, as many of you know. There's also the importance of history, and I do, in a tax audience, I feel I have to bring my legal history side to see that it matters where things start. Justice Holmes used to say, every time he saw a new idea, he went back to Plato and Aristotle to see who said it first. And Aristotle kind of really nailed this really early on. It's important to see this kind of development, right? And Chairman Camp's already mentioned the rhyming nature of tax politics. The Yogi Berra line is even better than the Mark Twain, but we're going to see lots of rhyming all throughout this history. And then, of course, there's significance behind the history. George Orwell has become very popular recently, and as he has put it, right, who controls the past controls the future, also true. And then, of course, this admonition from the German philosopher always reminds us that we ought to be paying attention to history, but we don't do a very good job of doing so, right? This is the quote that matters for an institutional history like JCT, and this comes from a modern American historian, Jim Kloppenberg, who's reminded institutionalists, social scientists rediscovered institutions about in the 90s, and he reminded them, well, you know, the particularities matter. It's people, it's power, it's place, it's time, the specificity of these things really matter. Institutions do not fall from the sky, and so I want to bring some of that human agency and historical contingency to this story. So now that I've squandered my first 5 minutes with those platitudes, let me get to the actual history and start with the origins. And it begins with some historical context that many of you probably already know about, that the JCT is in the early 20s after World War I. The wake of World War I is absolutely enormous. George Yin has done the definitive histories. This is a work of synthesis on my part. I have just really gone through George's excellent origin story and the work of other historians and political scientists and social scientists about this. But you can see what changes. The income tax really becomes to dominate. And there is, of course, at the end of the day, a ratchet effect, as political scientists call it. You can see it in a number of ways. This is just the growth in federal revenue because of the war, and you can see we never go back. Crises moments are moments of plasticity and historical contingency in which there is clearly a ratchet effect. I think we've all seen that throughout. But it's not just the actual revenue, the complexity of the law just grows enormously, not just the rates and lower exemptions, but something called an excess profits tax. Sounds completely deaf tone today, but this was an idea to go after munitions makers who were profiting off the war, and then liberalize depreciation allowance. All this led to, as historian Robert Cuff very nicely put it, that an administrative army marched into Washington before a military force even sailed overseas. You can see that with just the Bureau of Internal Revenue figures, the forerunner of the IRS, the five-fold increase in personnel that, again, does not go back to the pre-war period, right? The ratchet effect exists in the administrative aspects as well. And so we see this need for expertise very early on. Thomas S. Adams, who was probably the leading spokesperson for the Treasury during World War I, the architect of the World War I fiscal state, said this immediately after the war, that the system is an intolerable administrative burden, so complicated that neither taxpayers nor administrators can understand it, right? So there's someone on the inside suggesting. So the beginnings of the JCT are really with a House Ways and Means proposal for a temporary commission to simplify tax laws, right? So there is this crying need for more, better administration. And then we see, of course, on the Senate side, a slightly different story, as George has done a terrific job showing, which is a hysteria of investigations in 20. The Harding administration, Teapot Dome is something we've all learned in our high school classes, and other scandals lead to greater congressional oversight. And then, of course, there's this very interesting story between a feud between Senator James Cousins and Andrew Mellon, who's Treasury Secretary, and it really starts as a policy debate that turns very personal. And George has done a terrific job, and if we have more time, I might go into it. But what it leads to is Senator Cousins actually having a Senate investigation of the Bureau of Internal Revenue based on excessive refunds, is the claim. And what they find is not widespread corruption of any kind, but sort of limited and uneven treatment of taxpayers. And so the Senate calls for its own staff to oversee the BIR's work. And so the actual legislative history has both of these things, the demand for greater expertise from the House and oversight from the Senate. The two are merging together in the 86 Revenue Act that creates JCT. And you see that this is about a battle about authority and power, that Congress doesn't want to just be a mere rubber stamp of Treasury policies. The monopoly of expertise is in Treasury in this period, especially during World War I. And so this is a congressional attempt to pull back some of that power. And so there's a shifting balance back towards Congress. And so there's greater resources to monitor tax funds. That's coming from the Senate side, and this kind of watchdog function. And then we also see greater expert staff that are independent of Treasury to assist with the tax legislative process, right? And then this is the key statutory authority. I won't go into the details, but you can see the staff starts very small. There's one professional staffer, Lovell Parker, and he's not an economist or a lawyer. He's an MIT engineer because they're concerned about the depletion allowances being the most complicated issue they're going to deal with, right? So you can see it starts in very different ways. And today, it's led at the time by Ways and Means Chair William Green, and so he divides the JCT into these two important functions, with simplification and oversight both being there. And so there are some early achievements. I'm going to speed along so we can get through my 20 minutes before Rich gives me the hook here. There is an attempt to bring expertise through simplification, improving administration and reforming what they call the phraseology, the terminology, consolidating offices, and a number of other ways in bringing this reform to it. And then, of course, we get to the Colin Stamm era, the Stamm and down. And I've used Stamm because of his long running role as chief, but also his relationship with Dalton. And so, of course, the 30s and 40s are a critical period in American history because of the rise of the New Deal order and World War II and the move to a mass income tax, right? A move away from just a small sliver of taxpayers to the vast majority of people. And so you can see from this graph what happens to federal spending, first with the New Deal, but then, of course, World War II is the major inflection. And again, the ratchet effect, we never go back. Right, crises lead to this. And so just briefly, who are these people? Stam's a Great War veteran. He's a trained lawyer, gets his law degree at night while he's working for the Bureau of Internal Revenue, rises to general counsel, and then hired by Green to the JCT in 27, and then is I think, still the record-holding longest chief of staff in this very long period. There's a picture of Stam. Robert Muley was his nickname. You can guess why. A little stubborn lawmaker, but very, very much the typical New Deal Southern Democrat. Ways and Means chair for many years. This is before the modern policy of rotating. And he really provided Stam and the JCT with a lot of political cover. He's quoted on the House floor many a time, standing by Colin Stam's analysis and statements throughout that time period. And they have several legislative accomplishments. This is more Dalton than it is Stam, but they had such a close relationship, it's hard to believe there isn't evidence in the historical record showing some assistance with the Social Security Act. Here's the actual. The real achievement for Stam is the codification of the Internal Revenue Code in 1939, the first time that's done. And it really just does, it's a monumental task, takes literally over a decade to do, and it really fundamentally restructures our tax law in a more rational, routinized kind of way and becomes a model for future codifications. And so you also see Stam professionalizing at both the staff as well as access to JETA, getting more direct access, and creating a norm. He calls this himself. He says, there's nothing in the statute that says JCT should be part of the tax legislative process. It becomes an evolving norm. It's the expertise, it's the turn by lawmakers to the experts for some assistance in this process over time. So you see this increasing autonomy from the executive, but there's a kind of adversarial relationship that develops, at least during the Stam years, between Treasury and JCT in particular, and it's most signified by Stanley Surrey, who I will get to in just a second. So a few of the criticisms that have come across the historical record is that because of Stam's role, he really cherished his role in power. Here's a terrific quote from an oral history in the 60s. He'd been here so long that he wasn't like other staff men. This is from a senator. He was the only staff man I knew who could tell a senator to go to hell without getting his face slapped. He knew the power and authority that he had, and he was a bit willing to exercise it. This fellow Stam was an autocrat. He played everything close to his vest. I always felt that he was an ally of big business. So these were some of the examples of a lack of kind of neutrality. Let me speed up a little bit. To really get to the other point, which is that there is evidence of a very strong pro-taxpayer slant. And the 1951 Lewis Mayer Amendment, it was a classic rifle shot benefit that applied only to one person, Lewis Mayer, and saved him a lot of money. We can talk more in the Q&A about that. But let me get, in the few minutes I have left, to the Woodworth-Mills period, because I think that's a very important period, and I think this is where we do see a more accelerated shift. Now, of course, the broader historical context is that this is the golden years of the post-war Western capitalist economies. Things are booming. This is what Gene Sturley and Elliot Brownlee have called the era of easy finance. You didn't have any trade-offs with a booming economy for all those years, and bracket creep, right? Of course, everything changes in the 70s with stagflation. So this is the context in which Larry Woodworth and Mills are operating. Woodworth is an economist, not a lawyer. He's hired very young, spends his entire career, practically his entire career, and becomes Stam's natural successor. Wilbur Mills, as I'm sure many of you know, very famous, sort of great New Deal, Great Society, liberal Southern Democrat. And Larry and Wilbur had a very close relationship. According to Bill Archer, Larry was whispering in Wilbur's ear over and over again. Everyone knew that Wilbur Mills knew a lot about tax, but it's because he had Larry right behind him, is what Bill Archer and others have said. So let me just quickly get to the achievements of this group and some of the criticisms. The Tax Reform Act of 1969, very important element, and you actually see some continuity here because Larry Woodworth's actually really willing to work with Stan Surrey, who has a lot of these ideas when he's in Treasury. So there is some continuity and a much tighter relationship between JCT and Treasury. And then there's the Congressional Budget Act. And of course, the most important thing I would argue in the Woodworth mirrors is the review of President Nixon's tax return. And Joe Thorndike has written about this at the last celebration. It really, I think, demonstrated the kind of autonomy that JCT had, the professionalism and the trust and confidence in JCT that grew as a result of Nixon's. There were also a number of other changes at the JCT in terms of the norms of helping both sides, unlike Stam, at least allegedly, who did not do so much of that. And then this, again, growing trust and confidence, which is very important in this time period, given what's going on all around this country. The late 60s, the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights era, all this is eroding trust, but this is an important element in JCT's development of this greater expertise. And what Stan Surrey himself calls a collaborative link. He was quite positive about his relationship with Larry Woodworth, not so much with Colin Stam, right? Some of the criticisms was that Stam was not very good at delegating. I think anyone who's run anything that's large knows that's hard to do. And then, of course, greater complexity, although I'm not sure Stam is responsible for that. The world has gotten more complex, and so has the Internal Revenue Code for obvious reasons. I have some other things I'll say, but I'm running out of time, so we can save some of this for a Q&A. But the important part is that I think Woodworth in particular believed in bipartisan expertise as a collaborative kind of experience, right? I don't think he held on to any kind of noble dream of pure, nonpartisan, neutral objectivity. I think he had a much more realistic, pragmatic view of the JCT role, very different than I think some of the earlier periods. So let me stop there and cede my whatever time I don't have. I think there's one more. We'll save the Tax Reform Act for the Q&A.
Rich, before John talks, can I share the little tidbit you found on Stam's obit?
Yeah, go ahead.
So Rich, being a good reporter, looked up Stam's obit in the New York Times, which has this incredible paragraph. Mr. Stam, a big, heavy-set, bald man who paid little attention to his appearance, had few interests outside of the tax field. He seldom talked about himself and then would give only the sparsest information. As far as most acquaintances knew, his main recreation was walking his dog in Chevy Chase.
All right, I'm actually wondering, was Plato a consumption tax guy or an income tax guy? But we can get to that later. Alan's going to talk about kind of the interaction between JCT and the academic world, particularly economists.
Just as background, I spent 1 year plus working for the Joint Committee on Taxation in the early 90s. I've served on a couple of advisory panels in the years since. And of course, as an academic interested in tax policy, I'm a great beneficiary of all the analysis in all the pamphlets that the now online, that the Joint Committee on Taxation puts out explaining provisions of new laws as well as the workings of the existing provisions of the tax system. And over the years, I've learned a lot from my contact with the Joint Committee on Taxation and its products about the differences between the way academic economists think about and approach problems and the way economists working in government at the Joint Committee on Taxation and elsewhere have to deal with these problems. And so I wanted to say something about how these approaches or perceptions differ and how each side contributes to the other. I would say at the outset that from my experience over the years, the economists who work at the Joint Committee on Taxation use very much the latest analysis produced by academics and others, the latest economic analysis. It's very important to them to stay current with developments in the field, and when new research is relevant to analysis that they do, revenue estimates that they do, they're on top of it. And so the contributions in that direction, I just want to stipulate at the beginning. And I want to say more about the contributions that the work of government economists, particularly economists at the Joint Committee on Taxation, what that contributes to the way academics think about things. And so I want to just use 4 examples of topics where I think academics have traditionally a certain way of thinking about things. How it's different in Washington, and how over the years, at least in some cases, these differences have academics have become aware of these differences and modified their research as a result. The first is what I might call inertia in ideas and legislation. So if academics are saying, well, what's the best way of accomplishing X, or how high should we set the top marginal tax rate or something like that, they'll go about their analysis, come up with an answer, and say this is the answer. And they won't necessarily agree, and there may be a lot of uncertainty about it, but that's the way the process works. In my observation, there's more inertia in the process, and I'll give you a couple, in the actual process, I'll give you a couple of examples. Over the years, we've at times had a top individual marginal tax rate of 39.6%. Now that's not a particularly round number, so you might wonder, well, where did that come from? Well, I think I know where it came from because I was working at the Joint Committee that year. It was originally conceived, perhaps earlier, but it was certainly conceived in 1992, as a 10% surtax to what was being proposed as an increase in the top marginal rate to 36%. And this would have been a millionaire surtax of 3.6%, 10% of the top marginal rate for those with incomes over $1 million. And so that's where 39.6 came from. Now, when that rate was eventually introduced in 1993, it was no longer a millionaire surtax. It was my memory serves, it was more like a quarter millionaire surtax. But it was still 39.6%. And of course, it went away with the Bush tax cuts in 2001. But during the Obama administration, when there was a resolution of what to do about the Bush tax cuts, it was decided to raise taxes again for people at the top of the income distribution. It went right back to 39.6%, as if that was some sort of natural constant. I'll give you it was proposed again during the Biden administration. It didn't happen, but again, when they proposed increasing the top marginal tax rate from what it had been from 2017, again, it was 39.6%. Other provisions are present like that. The personal exemption phase out, the so-called PEP provision, the limited itemized deductions, the so-called PEACE provision, which were introduced in 1990. They came back in 2012 as well. They went away in 2017. I'm sure people are fondly remembering them and thinking about putting them back again, too. Well, what's my explanation for this? I guess I would call it limited bandwidth. That is, there's we know this provision worked. And when I say worked in perhaps many respects. It was something that could get a coalition of members to vote for. There were no specific problems that enough members had with it that it would fail. And it didn't have any terrible economic or other kinds of effects because it was in practice and seemed to work passably well. And so I think that what's on, and there are other examples I can think of that I won't mention, but I think these are all there, and it suggests that the way ideas percolate and stay on the radar screen is something that is quite relevant to the policy process and really not something academics have thought of. And I start with this one, but this is one where I think academics still have not confronted the way the policy process actually works. My second example is what I would call direct and indirect provisions. So, if you're an academic and you're thinking about increasing taxes on high-income people, you might say, well, maybe we should raise the top marginal tax rate. I guess I'd call that a direct provision. That's a way of raising taxes. But going back at least to the Tax Reform Act of 1986, we've had other ways of doing it. Now, in that act, which was billed as having no marginal tax rate higher than 28%, there actually was a hidden 33% bracket. It wasn't that hidden, it was in the legislation, but in descriptions of the legislation, it was not really there, phasing out of the 0 and 15% brackets as income went up. They were the aforementioned PEAS and PEP provisions, which are provisions that increase taxes on people above certain incomes, but not simply by hitting them with a higher marginal tax rate, but by reducing tax benefits in a way that was not all that different from raising their marginal tax rate, but had some sort of funny quirks to it. For example, the personal exemption phase out was a tax on people with big families relative to small families. The PEAS provision was misunderstood, at least in the case of most taxpayers, as reducing their incentives to, say, make charitable contributions. It didn't really work that way, but it was sufficiently confusing that some people didn't understand that. So, why do we have things like this? Well, there's obviously some reason why we have provisions like this, because we have lots of them. I could mention also the net investment income tax that was introduced as part of the Affordable Care Act. Again, collecting additional taxes on higher income people, but not in such a straightforward manner. Now, I would say academics have begun to appreciate what's going on here, really through the subfield of behavioral economics. And we have concepts in that subdiscipline, such as inattentiveness or masked attributes. The idea that you can do things the simple way, the straightforward way, the transparent way, or you can do it in ways that aren't so transparent. Maybe people won't notice, or maybe some people won't notice, and maybe it's a way of getting things through, and so you can say, well, we really didn't raise the top marginal tax rate, even though you kind of did. And I think that is something that kind of behavior is not necessarily in this particular example, but more generally, I think that kind of behavior, both on the part of government and the part of businesses, I think is now something that economists do look at. Simplicity. As distinct from transparency. Academics will typically try to come up with what they think of as the best way, given some criteria of doing something, and say we should do it that way. In the real world, sometimes simplicity seems to matter more. I'll give you an example, two examples. In 2003, we during the Bush administration, reduced the tax rate on dividends. We already had a lower tax rate on capital gains, and then we added a lower tax rate on dividends. The original proposal by the administration then was one based on a study that the Treasury had done in 1992 during the George H.W. Bush administration, which would have given individuals, shareholders, a credit for taxes paid by corporations on their profits when the individuals received the dividends, to the extent that corporations actually had paid tax on those profits before distributing them. What we actually did in 2003 was just cut the tax rate on dividends. Were the effects exactly the same? No. And you could certainly argue that the original proposal was pure in what they were trying to do. But I think at some point along the way, in this early 2003, it was decided that it was just simpler to cut the tax rate on dividends. There's been an argument for a long time before 2017 that some state and local taxes shouldn't have been deductible, because state and local taxes go for both private and public purposes. If I'm paying taxes to my state government to provide benefits to low-income people, and I'm a high-income taxpayer, I'm not getting much personal benefit from that. On the other hand, if I'm paying property taxes to my local government to maintain parks and swimming pools in my jurisdiction, there's a large private element to that. And so there were reasonable arguments that you shouldn't have all state and local taxes deductible. Perhaps some should be deductible, some shouldn't be deductible. Well, what we did in 2017 was we said, well, $10,000 is deductible. and we modified that last year a little bit. Well, that's a lot simpler. It's not, it could be motivated with the argument I just gave, but it's $10,000 isn't always the right answer. But again, I think there's a simplicity argument for doing that way. And economists, I think, have been engaging with the benefits of simplicity in the tax policy process. Certainly in understanding the benefits of higher standard deductions so that more people don't have to itemize. There's even been papers looking at estimating the costs that taxpayers face in deciding to itemize. And so I think that one is something that academics have really benefited from. And the final example or area I wanted to talk about is tax incidence, by which economists mean not who has a statutory obligation to pay a tax, but who actually has the burden, bears the burden of the tax. Now, for a long time, academics have emphasized that it's the structure of the tax and how it's imposed, and not the statutory incidence that matters. And we might use as an example the fact that it shouldn't really be that different whether we were looking at the employer or the employee part of the payroll tax. It should have the same incidence because it's interposed between what the employee gets and what the employer pays. But we have other examples too, where if academic economists were right, then there wouldn't be any justification for having that. We have other examples where taxes are imposed in a way that suggests that statutory incidence may matter more than academic economists think. Another example is the so-called Cadillac tax, which no longer exists, but was introduced as part of the Affordable Care Act, which was an excise tax on the providers of so-called Cadillac health insurance policies that were more expensive than a certain threshold. Now, it was intended to effectively eliminate the tax benefit that employees get from employer-provided health care over and above an allowable amount. But it was introduced as an excise tax on the insurance companies, which kind of makes you think that somebody thought that it would be perceived or might even be a tax on insurance companies who, it's easier to, put a tax on than all of your hardworking constituents. In recent years, I think academics, and there have been recent papers, for example, looking at the difference between employer and employee taxes on payroll and suggesting reasons why they might have different incidents. Not because there's anything wrong with the original academic arguments, but because there are subtle differences, such as if you wanted to change the payroll tax differently for different groups of people, and it's really hard to break wage agreements only with some people and not with others, then putting the tax on individuals allows the taxes to change differently, but if you put it on employers, they can't really change wages differentially to offset that. And so academics, I think, have become a little bit more sophisticated in the way we analyze tax incidence, perhaps justifying the care that is given in Congress in deciding on whom to impose taxes. So in short, the contributions between academic economists and economists at the Joint Committee on Taxation and elsewhere in government goes both ways. JCT certainly benefits from academic research, and academics have been benefiting from the analysis and the environment in which JCT works. There's an old joke about an academic economist being someone who sees something work in practice and wonders if it would work in theory. But it's not really a joke in this case, because this is, in a sense, what I've been saying, that academic economists have their theories, and in looking at the way things actually work, realize that there's something wrong with their theories, and that they, not just their empirical work, but the theories on which their empirical work is based need modification. Thanks.
Great, thank you. John promised he was going to tell us some war stories, so I don't know exactly what he's got in mind, but he's got some. Go ahead, John.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks to Tom and the JCT staff for inviting me to be on this distinguished panel. JCT was really where it all started for me and was a critical springboard for my career. I see Hank sitting in the front row, and a debt of thanks to Hank for bringing me on and for Alan. It's funny, at the 90th anniversary party, Joe Mykert and I asked Tom why 90, and Tom said, well, I may not be there at 100. Well, here we are again. So, as Rich said, I'm going to tell some more stories, but also try and give you a perspective of my view from several different vantage points, from my vantage point as a member of the JCT staff, then at at Finance Committee, then Treasury, and then finally from the private sector. My first day at Joint Committee, Mel Thomas, who was a longtime JCT staffer and legend, walked into my office and said, we're going to draft this GST proposal at 2 o'clock, and would you like to come and help me out? Well, I had stayed at a Holiday Inn Express the night before, but I knew nothing about the generation skipping transfer tax at that moment. So I did a lot of research early in the morning, got myself prepared, and actually the JCT staff in the room will laugh at this, but prepared my own legislative draft. We walked into Ledge Counsel's office, and I pulled out my draft very dutifully and handed it out. Maurice Foley said, why don't you leave that to the professionals? Luckily, Lindy came to my defense and said, let's look at his draft and see if he's got anything interesting. And luckily, I had 1 or 2 points that they hadn't thought about. So, but that shows you, back in the day, it was a very collaborative process between JCT staff, Ledge Counsel, and finance, in this case, Finance Committee majority and minority staff. And a lot of my career was spent in those drafting sessions learning from Ledge Counsel, learning from working with more senior lawyers at JCT on a collaborative basis. The way JCT was organized and is still organized today, I think, is broken into subject matter so that you could be a couple people were the estate and gift tax experts. I see Cecily in the back. She and I were the insurance and partnership experts at the time and worked very collaboratively together, and I learned a lot from her. I see Caroline and several other fellow members out in the staff members out in the room. But we had people who were veterans of '86, so they'd seen pretty much it all. And honestly, there was almost nothing they had never seen before. One time I walked into Harold Hirsch's office and asked if he had seen a constitutional issue before that I was getting asked about. And Harold, who had a near photographic memory, remembered a letter that Ivans, Phillips, and Barker had sent him 15 years earlier on the subject. He didn't have the letter, but Mel did. So I had it in my hands in like 5 minutes. And again, this is pre-internet, so you can imagine how important that was. We also had the benefit of working with the policy economists and the revenue estimators. And I learned a ton from them. For a young tax lawyer, learning for economists and holding your own with economists gives you a hell of a lot of confidence that you can work in the tax policy space, and it certainly served me well throughout my career. We had a unique opportunity in those days. There were 6 policy economists on Alan's team, including luminaries like Mark Mazur, Marty Sullivan, Tom, obviously, and a number of others. So, and then we had even most people don't know who aren't Joint Committee aficionados. We have the Refund Counsel's Office. And Norm Brand, for example, was someone I worked closely on a number of things. You learned a lot. They saw a lot. You obviously got some ideas for revenue raisers from them, et cetera. So, and then there was the opportunity from the Joint Committee staff to help the other tax writing staffs. And I worked on a number of really interesting issues in the early 90s that were just coming to the fore. Most notably, consumption taxes was a big issue. Tom and I worked on a pamphlet together. Hank was coming up with a VAT pamphlet, but I got to work on, and I see Bill Hoagland in the audience, I got to work on Nunn Domenici and Bourne Danforth, and so it hasn't really served me that well in my private sector career, but I am a leading expert on consumption tax.
Just wait. Just
Yeah,
wait.
yeah,
Your
yeah,
time will
yeah,
come.
my time will come, maybe when I'm 110 or something like that. But I also designed the first qualified family-owned business exclusion, and you know, items like that with Senator Dole's staff and Senator Ross' staff. Ledge Council was a learning experience for everybody as we got challenged by people like John Buckley, Stan Grimm, Jim Franson to sort of test our proposals and run them through. And then we got the opportunity to work with notable outside practitioners who were doing their best to inform us, but also to educate us. Another war story involving Mel, and you'll hear Mel come up a lot, was the issue of facets for a financial account securitization investment trust. They no longer exist, which I think was predictable, but we'll stop there. But anyways, we were trying to figure out what a facet was, and Mel and Steve Rosenthal were working collaboratively with the outside practitioners, which I forget exactly, Mike Schler was one that comes to mind. But they didn't ever put pen to paper, and I couldn't figure that out. They were doing lots of meetings, but they never outlined it. And Mel came into my office one day and said, "John, I think I figured out what a facet is. I think it's a partnership." And so I was the partnership expert along with Cecily. I had to go and work with Mel, sit down and figure it out. I outlined what I thought the issues were, and I went into Mel's office a week later and I said, "Mel, I know one thing." And he said, "What's that?" And I said, "It's not a partnership." So, shifting gears to Finance Committee. I got asked, again, because of my work at Joint Committee, one of the things that some people don't know, but there are Joint Committee staff on both sides of the Hill. So you work on the House side and the Senate side. And I was put in the Dirksen Senate office. And so I had a lot of interaction with Finance Committee staff, with my good friend Mark Prater in the back there. Mark was the Chief Tax Counsel on the Republican side, and I was then asked by Senator Moynihan to be the Chief Tax Counsel for the Democratic side. It was because I was in Dirksen that I got asked that, I think, and so thanks for that as well. But Joint Committee was a huge resource to a staff person serving on the House or Senate tax writing committees. And they not only helped us draft specs and come up, with revenue estimates and determine behavioral assumptions, but they really helped you think through an issue and fine-tune it and polish it and refine it. A friend of mine, Glenn Cole, used to refer to the Joint Committee as the high tax priest of tax policy. That may be damning with vain praise, but I do think that there's some truth to that, because if you had gone through the process of working with Joint Committee on anything that you were developing, you knew that it had been pressure tested. They also helped us prepare for hearings, markups, and floor action. They developed hearing pamphlets, the chairman's mark descriptions, and the committee reports. One element of that I think is, and we're going to talk, I think, later about the fact that there haven't been that many markups recently, and that as a result, there aren't that many committee reports. But that legislative history was critical. The continuity of Joint Committee in the process from the House side to the Senate side, where they had been involved in the House side, could help you as a Senate staffer understand where the House was. Now, obviously, Joint Committee will keep confidences and things like that, but they can help you understand the policies underlying certain things. They also helped us develop questions for witnesses for hearings, revenue estimates and distribution tables. One story, in '95, the Republicans were breaking a bill into two pieces. They didn't want the EITC changes lopped in with all the other tax changes because that would skew the distribution tables. And I reached out and asked JCT for a distribution table of both bills. We got those put together, and all of a sudden, there was a lot of press attention on what the distribution was. So it's things like that where they play it straight and they help the Democratic minority when the Republican majority was trying to do something. The other thing is the Byrd rule was extremely important in our day, but even more so today, because a lot of things are being run through reconciliation. But JCT obviously is critically important to that because their estimates are the referees for what has an out-year effect or what doesn't score or some of the other arcane Byrd rules, which I'm not going to get into here. I do think that there are notable changes between when I was on the Finance Committee and now. Obviously, we have less regular order. You don't go from the House to the Senate necessarily in one step. You don't go through committee, infrequent hearings, less questions from members, et cetera. And I think there's greater member staff involvement and leadership involvement than there used to be at the committee level. And then finally, I think we used to have a bullpen in the back of the Senate where we would sit as JCT staff and help advise the members, et cetera. I remember Hank thought he was a member, so he would go in and start talking to the senator. But we all sat there and helped. Now I hear from Tom that they don't do that anymore, that there's no JCT presence on the Senate floor. And I think that may be an unfortunate element of modern technology. Quickly, I'll run through sort of my view from Treasury. When I left the... What's that? Oh, yeah, thank you. There's a lot of... there is still a lot of, well, at least when I was there was a lot of collaboration between JCT and Treasury when possible. We were in the era of corporate tax shelters when I was at Treasury. We worked to develop our proposals, but also a pamphlet on corporate tax shelters. I see Ron in the room. Ron obviously was the chief of staff of Joint Committee. We got a lot of input from the ABA, which Ron was very active in, on tax shelters at the time. And they did the same with JCT. And then JCT and us would get together and sort of compare notes and try and come up with proposals. One notable proposal, and this is where I think the process is probably not quite as good as it used to be, is that if we came up with something that was going on in the marketplace, we would immediately call Joint Committee and tell them about it. And one issue was the so-called liquidating REIT proposal. We discovered that banks were running their mortgages through REITs and then liquidating them. And I sent Secretary Rubin a memo that said, hey, we've discovered this shelter and we think that it will save the government $48 million to shut it down. And Rubin sent me back a note that said, why do I care? And I said that was supposed to be a B, billion. But anyways. We also testified at markups together. The Treasury Assistant Secretary and the JCT Chief of Staff sat next to each other and testified and shared a lot of ideas with each other. I'll tell a story. When Ken Keyes was Chief of Staff, I was Assistant Secretary, and we were in disagreement on an Indian gaming issue when we were testifying in the Ways and Means Committee, and all these chiefs, Indian chiefs, walked in with their headdresses on, which intimidated probably Ken more than me because he was on the other side of that issue. So, we compared notes. I think our estimators were constantly comparing notes both on modeling and revenue estimates. We shared industry and technical expertise, and we shared information. The other thing that Joint Committee did for us at Treasury that I found exceptionally useful, and probably this is the first time I've told Tom this, but we used to give a Green Book briefing and go through sort of, our thinking. But Treasury then would do an analysis of the administration's budget with either the pros and cons, or it was effectively a pros and cons. And the next year, when most things that were in our budget didn't pass, we would refine our thinking and improve our proposals. So again, that was sort of an informal blessing. The other thing at Treasury that we worried about was that JCT would protect congressional prerogatives. And again, they would criticize our proposals in these markups, and then we would have to defend them. But also, if we had done something, we would then generally come up for a briefing. But I remember one time we had a notice we put out to shut down another shelter called Fast Pay, Slow Pay, which was designed to allow taxpayers to deduct principal rather than interest. And I got summoned by Ken to come up and talk, and I had all my former JCT colleagues in a room, and it was pretty intimidating. And luckily for me, Ken messed up a little bit. He said, "Have you ever heard of the Moline Products case?" And I said, "No, but I have heard of Moline Properties," and that sort of let the air out of the balloon a little bit and took the pressure off. Finally, I'll close just with a real quick brief view from the private sector. Obviously, Joint Committee has still tremendous technical breadth and expertise. I always advise my clients, if you have a proposal that you get in early to see JCT, advise them of your proposal, because if you want to get something passed, you're going to have to run that gauntlet at some point, and they can help you issue spot and identify pitfalls early in the process. That sometimes requires you to read body language rather than definitive responses, but it does help because you can sort of see where JCT is on a particular issue, and they always ask good questions. You also may make changes that help you with the revenue estimates. Obviously, if you want to minimize a revenue estimate or maximize an estimate, JCT can be helpful there. They also, have tremendous discretion in the process. They keep things that you say in confidence in general, and that's always appreciated. And again, I'll emphasize the continuity in the process. They're the only players involved in both sides of the hill. It's, also, as Alan said, it's a tremendous source of information and history. The JCT has an excellent website, but the legislative history is always my go-to place to start looking at why a proposal was done, and if I don't remember, and remind myself. So it's really a wonderful institution. I hope that I'm asked to do this 100 years from now. So thanks very much.
Great, thank you. David?
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be in this room with so many people who taught me a lot about taxes, both in my job at the Wall Street Journal and at the Brookings Institution. And talk about intimidating. This is one intimidating physical space. I can only imagine what it's like to be a witness in here, which I hope never to be. I think everybody in this room understands the important role that JCT plays in making tax policy. If you didn't, you wouldn't be here. I think relative to its influence, it's probably the lowest profile of any institution in town. And one of the measures I have of its importance is every once in a while, the members of Congress move a little too fast, and JCT doesn't get a chance to kind of make something make sense. I'm a little bit familiar with the Opportunity Zone provision of the TCJA, and I tell you, it would have been better if JCT had had another week to fix it, especially since the technical corrections bill never passed. I think for reporters, JCT is an incredible resource. I mean, the expiring provisions, the blue books. If you want to know something, and you can find it on the JCT website, you get an authoritative answer. The press treats JCT scores as authoritative. If you say, according to the Joint Committee on Taxation, it's a signal of credibility. And in big disputes like TCJA or reconciliation bills, JCT numbers drive headlines. I think that the nonpartisan issue is a real one. And my definition of nonpartisan is, we believe in the press, and I think most of the people in this room, that you get the same answer if a Democrat proposes something and a Republican. That's my definition of nonpartisan. It doesn't mean you're neutral or completely blind to political realities, but your decisions, your analysis, your numbers are not determined by which member of Congress happens to make the proposal. Now, as far as I know, the JCT does not routinely brief the press. It's a small staff, only 60 people. I think JCT sometimes does answer reporter queries. I can't remember all the details, but I remember being at the Wall Street Journal and there was some bill that was popping up that had something to do with capital gains taxes. And I remember calling Hank Gutman at 8 o'clock in the morning and saying, Hank, you have to help me understand the effective date of this bill before the markets open, because I don't want to get it wrong and sink the markets. I have no recollection of what the bill was or what your answer was, but you were very helpful, so I thank you for that. JCT does not do public-facing messaging. It rarely defends its methodology in real time, so the press interprets, sometimes well, sometimes not, and the press is a little sometimes vulnerable to spin from people who have an axe to grind. When JCT becomes the story, though, dynamic scoring, distributional tables, why does JCT say this? And when the proponents say that, does JCT underestimate the growth effects of cutting taxes on investment? In those cases, its nonpartisan status is crucial, but it's up to the press to kind of interpret what JCT is doing. There's a lot of things that, at an event like this, that you have these flashes from the past, and one of the things that strikes me is sometimes nonpartisan is important, but framing is not neutral. How something is framed often makes a difference in the public debate. And seeing Chairman Camp here, I was remembering the rapid rise and fall of the destination-based cash flow tax. And Chairman Camp suggested that when it gets proposed again, which it probably will be, it needs a better name. So Chairman Camp, I was on my phone going to ChatGPT, and here's the suggestion: Trade-Adjusted Revenue with Investment-Friendly Full Expensing Act. The acronym is TARIF.
It won't fit on a bumper sticker.
Now, I was asked to talk or volunteered to talk about the press and the public. I don't think the public has a clue about what JCT does. It doesn't appreciate the complexity, uncertainty. It doesn't understand that scores depend on baselines. It doesn't understand that timing shifts can dominate the 10-year window. It doesn't understand the difference between current law and current policy. And despite the efforts of good reporters like Richard Rubin, I'm not sure we'd want to see what the Gallup poll told us about what they know about these things. So that's a challenge. I am kind of intrigued that we've gotten now well over an hour and 20 minutes into this conversation, and I think I'm the first person to mention the phrase Congressional Budget Office. After all, in 1974, when Congress passed the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act, it assigned some set of responsibilities to JCT, revenues, and some set to the new CBO. And as I understand it, Ways and Means and Finance didn't want the new budget committees to become too powerful. Don't need to worry about that. So JCT has sole authority over revenues, and CBO does spending. I learned today that tariffs, even if they're Ways and Means bills, are actually scored by CBO. So take it for, I just assumed the opposite, so I was wrong. And there's sometimes a bit of confusion about who does what. And I think that becomes clearer in matters of dynamic scoring. When Congress asks for dynamic scoring of a tax bill, JCT does it. But then when CBO does its baselines, it does its own dynamic scoring of the effects that a tax bill will have on economic growth, investment, employment, and so forth. And I don't think a lot of people understand how this works. We had, thanks to the cooperation of CBO and JCT, a pretty good event at Brookings where economists from both institutions showed how they did things, and posted on their websites the slides, I think it was very useful, at least to insiders, to understand this is not easy, this dynamic scoring, how they use models and why they sometimes come to different answers as they did on the TCJA. Now, the fact is that CBO gets much more of the blame and much more of the credit for CBO's work. And I think the reason for that is that CBO has a different constituency. It really does see its constituency as the entire Congress, the press, and indeed the public. Its website is much more aimed at the public than the CBO website. It has the staff to do outreach to the public, and it briefs the press, and JCT hasn't done that over time, isn't as aggressive at sharing its models publicly. It clearly sees the members of the tax writing committees as its constituency, not the public, and that's probably as the legislation does. But here's the problem, I think. JCT is one of the most important institutions that most Americans have never heard of. And as deficits grow and reconciliation bills dominate, revenue scores are central to governing. And sometimes, not so much recently, but sometimes in the past, as Alan said, the distribution tables matter and sometimes influence political coalitions. So JCT's credibility rests on an appreciation of its technical expertise and a very strict nonpartisan culture, nonpartisan defined as I did earlier. But we live in an era of declining trust in institutions and distrust of experts. So I think the challenge ahead, and believe me, the Federal Reserve has learned that things that have been true for a long time you can't take for granted now. The challenge ahead for JCT is whether this is enough to protect it for another decade or two, let alone the next 100 years. I think the question is, can a highly technical, low visibility institution maintain its authority in a political system that increasingly demands transparency and narrative clarity and doesn't really trust experts?
Great. Thank you. So we've got about 40 minutes left. I'm going to ask one question to each of the panelists. Take 2 minutes or so, and then we'll get microphones set up for questions from the audience, because we covered a lot of ground. For Chairman Camp, coming off of what David said, JCT is a joint committee, right? It's a committee of Congress. It's not its own separate entity. When you were chairman, and particularly when their scores were an obstacle to things you might have wanted to do, like how tempting was it or was it not to kind of use the chairman gavel more heavily than people have?
Well, I do remember when we started tax reform having a meeting with the Joint Committee, both senators and House members. I happened to be chairman at the time, and I thought, well, the greatest thing I could do is bring in James A. Baker III, who'd been through tax reform, and Dick Gephardt, who'd both been through the 86 Act. And the first thing James Baker said is he gave his testimony, and we had the members there, was, don't do it. So I was wondering why my staff suggested we bring him in. But, I do think there's a need for this sort of, there's some place you can go to get the answer that's the final answer. Doesn't mean I always agreed with every answer I got. I didn't always, particularly when you're in the minority, you don't always get the answer as quickly as you'd like to get. Especially, I remember working on the Affordable Care Act, and we did a Republican version that actually got some Democratic votes on the floor. You don't ever hear about that, but it took a long time to get our score. And meanwhile, we're in a public debate about what's the best approach on health care, yet we don't have our alternative with a measure. So I do think there's got to be somewhere where we can go and have the sort of arbiter or umpire that will resolve at least some of those technical issues. Now, clearly, then you get into the political process, and ultimately you have to have votes for the legislation that you're proposing, and so there's going to be a lot of back and forth. But I think that there's going to be more of a need for that. And I would say also one of the concerns maybe going forward is the competition from outside scoring institutions and entities that will call into question the scores that come from government agencies or whatever. And that's become more prominent in recent years and maybe the time when I was there. But I do remember, John, that Indian gaming vote. That was actually one of the more high drama votes in the entire time I was on the 24 years I was in Congress. That was a pretty important vote, but you don't forget those.
Did you side with Ken or John?
I met John. No,
I
John
don't,
was.
right, did you take Ken's side or John's side?
I was on John's side, actually. Bill Archer wasn't very happy with me. There were three of us that were.
For Professor Morocha, I'm curious if there are things that are worth sort of re-importing from the past, things that are about the way that JCT worked from that period of 26 through 86 that kind of atrophied or went away that might be useful to kind of resurrect somewhat.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it needs to be re-reported. I would say one of the positive signs, and other panelists have already commented on this, is the important role the JCT plays, not just in the tax legislative process, but especially on the revenue estimates. I think after 74, you clearly see the changing of the staff, Woodward's focus on econometric analysis, and how important that really is. And I think that's a good sign. I mean, David's right, we are in a new era of anti-expertise, but being able to get the same revenue estimates from a Democrat or Republican, to use your definition of nonpartisan, I think is still very, very important. And so I think that's kind of continuity is going to be very important, especially as we think about competition, as Chairman Camp put it, right? That in an era when there is such doubt or lack of confidence in experts and expertise, when there's more competitive voices, I think it becomes more challenging.
For Professor Auerbach, I'm curious, you talked about the sort of hidden rate, the bubble rate, the PEP and Ps, all these hidden things. How much is that sort of JCT enabling what members wanted to do versus, like how much should the staff kind of resist that and say, no, this is like hidden, it's gimmicky, or how much is their role to kind of do what members, find a way to do what members want to do?
I'm sure that if asked, the members, the staff, people on the staff would talk about the pitfalls of raising tax rates in a way that, has side effects through misunderstanding or through unintended side effects. But I think part of the nonpartisan approach is, if asked, I'm sure if a staff member were asked, is this the way you do it? The person might respond, probably not. But I think, if a member comes in with not doing something because of a lack of understanding, but because of an intent to accomplish some objective in a particular way, I think it's the nature of the way the Joint Committee staff works, that they're not going to, tell a member, I'm sorry, you can't do it, you shouldn't do it that way. If the member, it's more a matter of making sure the member knows what he or she is doing. And if they're doing something and they're doing it for a reason, then I think the approach that the Joint Committee staff works is to help the member accomplish whatever the member is trying to accomplish, even if that isn't necessarily a great idea.
And for John, you talked about kind of, as on the outside in your job now, vetting proposals with JCT early, but I'm sort of curious if you think they can be lobbied in the sense of, like, you see the score and then you're like, oh, no, we think it's actually should be lower or should be higher. Like, how open are they at that point in the process to kind of lobbying, however you'd put it, and how different is that conversation from, say, lobbying a member's office?
There we go. I think JCT is always open to getting new information and being educated from the outside, but you're not going to really get much insight into how they've scored the proposal. You're going to have to basically develop your own approach and go in and provide them with analysis, economic analysis or new information that I think would affect the revenue estimate, if that's what you're asking. So if you have to do your homework to go in and see JCT and argue with them about the way something may have been scored, either positively or negatively.
And then for David, do you think, I mean, you sort of outlined the differences between how JCT and CBO present themselves. Do you think that JCT should take a more CBO-like version? Are there some benefits to a more CBO-like approach to interacting with the press and the public? And do you think there's some merit in that, or are they sort of best in the posture they've been in for a while now?
Sure. Let me just comment on the last thing. I think that it was a good point that JCT, there are a lot of people out there now who try and figure out what JCT is going to do with a particular proposal. And technology has made it easier to kind of figure that out. And I think there's going to be competition from JCT from places like, the Tax Policy Center and the Budget Lab and Policy Engines and all that. Competition in the sense that people are going to ask JCT, why do these people have such a different answer than you have? My guess is that the JCT answer is probably right, but because they have much more resources and more understanding of that. So, look, I recognize that JCT has a limited budget and a limited staff, and that it's important to prioritize its job, which is to advise members of Congress. But as I think my remarks suggested, if it were up to me and I were a member of the Joint Committee, not the staff, I would tell them, I want to give you more money and you ought to think about being a little more public-facing, because these days, institutions of technical expertise, I gave the Fed as an example, can no longer rely on inertia to keep their independence and the public trust.
Great. Well, thank you. We've got microphones here. So feel free if you have a question. I think they're make sure they're live before you step on them. But yeah, just go over there. Identify yourself. I mean, I know who George is, but identify yourself and then ask a question. And I've got more, but feel line up, and we'll take as many as we can.
Hi, thank you. I'm George Yin. I have a question for Professor Marotra, but before I raise it, I just wanted to add a little tidbit to David Wessel's nice little story about Colin Stam liking to walk his dog. The story was that some lobbyist went out and actually got a dog so that he could go and walk his dog in the same place that Colin Stam walked, and lo and behold, they suddenly started to talk. So, but Professor Marotra, I think one of the comments you made was that in the course of the 100 years, there hasn't been some dramatic change in how the JCT works. And I wanted to get your reaction to two developments that oddly occurred roughly the same time. I think roughly the late 70s and early 80s for different reasons. One development is the one that you've been talking about a little bit, which is the role of revenue estimating. I think very clearly since that period, really the last 50 years, revenue estimating has the importance of that and the function that the JCT serves on that point has dramatically changed from the first 50 years, if you will. I looked at some revenue estimates that were done in the early years of the JCT. They were few and very crude, nothing like what you see in the last 50 years. And I think of it as a couple of things that were going on. One was, of course, the big growth in large deficits that occurred beginning about then. So suddenly, estimating became heightened importance. And then second thing, another factor was, of course, indexing, which came in 1981. And so suddenly there was a lot of pressure on figuring out what do things cost and what revenues and what's produced and so forth. And the important thing is that despite a lot of pressure, both internal and external, the JCT has managed to maintain a monopoly on that function, with the single exception that David was talking about dynamic scoring, where there's kind of a little bit of competition on that point. But in general, on ordinary traditional revenue estimating, JCT is the word. They have the single voice. You know, their word is at the end, the controlling word. So that's one development, and that means that the role of the staff, I think, has changed rather dramatically in that 50 years. Now, at the same time, there was a second development, again, about the same time, and I think of it as the 1980 election, when suddenly the Republicans took over the Senate for the first time in 40 years. Now, why was that important? Well, it was important because Bob Dole, who became the chair of the Finance Committee then, felt that the JCT staff was essentially a Democratic staff. And the reason, you know, was that, well, you had Wilbur Mills sitting there for however many years on the House side, and you had Russell Long sitting there more or less equally on the Senate side. And so the staff, although a nonpartisan staff, they had gotten used to working with closely the Democratic members of Congress. And that was the perception that Bob Dole had, fairly or unfairly. And so what he did was he said, I need professional experts on my staff, on the Finance Committee staff. And of course, soon after that, the Ways and Means followed, and soon after that, individual members followed. And so suddenly, the role that the JCT had played in the first 50 years, which was the single staff of tax experts, suddenly became really muted by all of these other folks, many of whom became, in a sense, more influential because they were closer to the members. The JCT, by definition, was serving everybody, and so in a sense was really not serving anybody directly. And now suddenly you had like Finance Committee staff were working directly under and so forth. So there is kind of, you know, a sense of a shift in the role of the JCT staff, and oddly it's about 50-50. That is the first 50 years and the second 50 years.
Thank you, George. No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate that when I said that there weren't radical ruptures, that there weren't shifts. There clearly, and I think you've identified the two biggest ones. We've already talked about how important that Congressional Budget Act of '74 was. And it was exactly for this kind of reason, where JCT really became the clearinghouse for revenue estimates in that sense. And so that is a significant. I will also add, we haven't said much about the tax expenditure budget, which is also something that JCT did. I use JCT's tax budget all the time in my teaching and writing, right? That's also a result of the '74 law, right? So I agree with you that you do see a greater shift in this period. And to the 80s, I mean, this is exactly why both the two periods you've identified, '70s, is the end of the era of easy finance. It's because of these larger macroeconomic forces that JCT takes on this much more important role in terms of revenue estimates and scoring, and in terms of the tax expenditure budget. And I would say that, you know, the 80s, it's clear, I mean, this is the end of the New Deal order, right? This is the beginning of the Reagan Revolution and everything that meant. And I didn't get to the '86 Act, but let me use this opportunity. Because there's such a strong bipartisan commitment to revenue neutrality early on in the drafting, estimates become even so much more important, right? I mean, I should say that all my historical sources are synthetic from George's work and Joe Thorndike, and of course, the Birnbaum and Murray book, which is a canonical kind of classic about the '86 Act. And there's this great back and forth between David Brockway and Packwood, all about revenue neutrality. How do I make this one change, and what's the estimate going to be, right? So I think in the 80s, it's even more pronounced how important in the creation of the '86 Act is an example of what you're talking about, I think.
Yeah. I mean, it strikes me that, and that's still true in the reconciliation bills too, right? Each of those come with not necessarily revenue neutral, but with a particular constraint. And so there's incredible pressure on what the estimates are. All right, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Pete Davis. I was the first computer revenue estimator at the Joint Tax Committee in March of 1974. I literally walked out of Treasury with a magnetic tape on my arm, and that was the first independent use of a model by Congress. I want to raise the issue of the accuracy of revenue estimates. They're estimates. It's rare that you get an actual. Okay, yes, the IRS can tell you exactly, how much AMT came in or maybe child credits, but most estimates can only be checked by retroactively estimating them. And I always tell people that, hey, if you're changing a rate, standard deduction, exemptions, it's probably accurate within 1 or 2%. On the other hand, I famously remember when we failed to talk Senator Long out of the windfall profits tax in 1980. And, if you've ever looked at a graph of oil prices, I mean, they're like this. And so, okay, crude was $50 a barrel, and we assume $50 a barrel plus 2% real for the next, it was a 5-year budget window back then. And so we came up with a number. My recollection, I'm not sure this is right, was $224 billion over 5 years. And so Jim Wetzler, the chief economist of the Joint Committee, sat at the table, and Senator Long flips up the outfielder sunglasses because his eyes didn't like the TV lights, and asked Jim, how much confidence he had in that estimate. And Jim unabashedly said, Senator, if you put a 50% confidence band on it, it could be plus or minus $100 billion. And Long immediately put the glasses back down and asked another question really quick. And so guess what? After the last Exxon court case was finalized a decade or two later, we raised $80 billion. And so I wanted to, as Alan knows, economists like confidence bands. What happens when you ask members, when you give them a confidence band?
That was, in my recollection, that was always an important issue, which is that the scoring process requires individual numbers, and saying that, there's a very high chance that you're going to be much higher or much lower. It's hard to think of how to redesign the process to incorporate such uncertainty. My recollection is that the Joint Committee revenue estimating process has two possible answers. A very specific number, or this proposal is so out there that we have no idea, and occasionally will decline to offer a revenue estimate, which of course makes life very difficult for the person requesting the revenue estimate. This is one of these differences between the way academics think about things, the way statisticians would think about things, and the way the policy process works. You made an important point, which is that the degrees of uncertainty vary a lot. And it is a problem when you have a piece of legislation with lots of scores for individual provisions, and some of them are changes in the standard deduction or something where there's a lot of experience and a lot of understanding of how the revenues would be affected, and then just some completely novel idea where you have no idea what the taxpayer response is going to be, and you may not even have data on what people will qualify for it or that kind of thing. And it's very difficult, but it's just one of those challenges of trying to use information in a way that is still suitable for the policy process.
Do you think the scores sort of get too much attention in the sense that we end up all focusing a lot on exactly where this is going to land, as opposed to, does that take away from sort of analysis of the merits of the policy somewhat?
To a certain extent, I do. I remember one piece of legislation I was working on while I was at the Joint Committee, where there was a commitment to, I believe, revenue neutrality. And it got to the point where they were looking at small provisions, and they were looking several places to the right of the decimal point in the revenue scores, because they'd already considered the big provisions, which, might be, 150 billion point and then 3 decimal places. But those last decimal places matter if you have a provision that costs $1 million and you want to sneak it into the legislation. And that's obviously silly. When you get to, because nobody really believes that that degree of precision exists. It may be convention to provide 3 decimal places, and indeed because some provisions are relatively small. But if you're putting a piece of something into the legislation or leaving it out because the 3rd decimal place is positive or negative for the aggregate bill, then you do seem to have lost focus and are looking at the wrong thing. On the other hand, I think you need some idea. I don't know how legislation was done before the Joint Tax Committee was doing revenue estimation, but perhaps it was just normally smaller, and so they had time to figure out what was happening. But if you're talking about very major changes, if I think about the 2017 legislation, the 2025 legislation, which had massive effects on the federal budget, it's hard to imagine undertaking either of those pieces of legislation without having the best revenue estimates available.
John, and if
Yeah, I would
and
just say,
think,
well, the revenue estimates make a huge difference on policy, and they're very, very much matter, and also the distributional tables make a huge difference on policy. So it may not stop the policy writ large from moving forward, but there will certainly be significant adjustments, and some policy will drop off altogether, depending on. So I'd say they're absolutely critical in terms of developing, and especially as we get into an era where deficits, we've been in this era for 20 years, but if deficits begin to matter again, I think it'll be even more important.
Yeah, and just to add to that, as we have done a number of major pieces of tax legislation through reconciliation, obviously the Byrd rule requires that you meet committee instructions. The committee instructions typically provide a specific number that you have to hit, and therefore things get changed in the process in order to hit that specific number. You also have the out-year effect issue, and so obviously with TCJA, for example, both the House and the Senate had to figure out ways to get around those out-year effects, either by putting offsets in a particular title or turning off provisions, which we then had to revisit in 2025. So you see that. The only other thing I was going to say is it hasn't come up, but Treasury has their own group of revenue estimators, and they produce revenue estimates of the budget proposals, which then, obviously that goes to my collaboration with JCT and Treasury. We discuss, the estimators get together, I think, informally and talk about their assumptions, et cetera. But Treasury's revenue estimates actually do control for sequestration and OMB processes, et cetera, so.
yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Dylan Durham, and Mr. Wessel, at the very end of your remarks, you were talking about how JCT would benefit from having more resources in terms of public relations. Along those lines, in the wake of Loper Bright, I'm wondering if the tax system would benefit from giving more resources to JCT so that there's more specificity when Congress passes a bill into law, and leaving less for an administration to fill up the details that are going to be much more susceptible to courts overturning.
I think one of the lawyers should answer that, but speaking on behalf of Tom Barthold, with whom I didn't coordinate, any argument you could give to explain why JCT needs a bigger budget is one worth making. I want to respond to something you said, Richard. So I think there's a danger here in blaming JCT for the failings of Congress. And there are things that would be good public policy that may not score nicely, or we may not be able to score. I mean, there's been some interesting work about H-1B visas. This isn't a JCT issue, this is a CBO issue. They would score as negative, costing the economy money because they couldn't dynamically score the increase that it might provide to GDP. They only could score the cost that some of these people might end up on the ACA. So even though most economists would believe that increasing the number of H-1B visas is a good idea and would have economically positive effects, it scores, or at least until recently, has scored negative, loses money. And at some point, we have the right to expect our members of Congress to say, this is a trade-off we're willing to make, despite whatever JCT scores. I don't think it's fair to hold JCT or CBO or any of the staff responsible for members of Congress who are too short-sighted to do something that's in the public interest.
Well, as the only former member of Congress on the panel, I have to say I would blame CBO.
Yeah, I figured that would go over well in this room.
Does anyone want to talk about Loper-Bright and just sort of the specificity of legal language? Right, we've talked a lot about the sort of economist side of JCT.
I think Loper-Bright, I'm not sure that JCT, given even significant more resources, could address all the issues you have to with Loper-Bright. I think that one of the failings, though, right now of not having regular order is we don't even have committee reports. And in general, those committee reports would provide a basis for Treasury to then regulate. And then you could put references to those committee reports in your preambles to regulations. That doesn't happen right now. What you're finding with Loper-Bright and in other cases as well, Treasury is really, now they're resource constrained because they're trying to answer all the questions in preambles based on, every comment letter that comes in, they have to remark about it. Loper-Bright obviously imposes restrictions on their authority, et cetera. So it's a tough issue. I'm just not sure the Joint Committee or giving more resources to the tax writing committees, given how quickly legislation typically moves, that you're ultimately going to find that solving the problem.
Microphone is still open if anyone wants it. I was curious, I think David talked about the transparency of the models and how well people can know where the revenue estimates come from and how they're derived. Curious if anyone has any thoughts on how well JCT explains, whether public relations-wise or just in its writing explains where revenue estimates come from and how they work, or whether there are some improvements or changes they could make.
This is a difficult question, actually. So the question, in my time at JCT, the question came up, how much should models be open source in our current terminology? To what extent should they be available to anybody to do their own estimates? I think in a simple world without politics, that sounds like a good idea. But I think the way to think about the revenue estimating process is it's one in which the estimator is interacting with the model. You're estimating something you haven't estimated before. You may run through the model. The answer may not come out looking quite right, given what you know or other experience. You might think about modifying the model. Maybe there's some additional data or additional evidence that you might incorporate. And it's if you are sort of frozen in time, a model of a particular vintage, and you say, this is the model we use, and it's out there in the public, I think that makes that process of learning more difficult. Now, can that process be corrupted? Sure. I mean, if the Joint Committee didn't have the reputation that it has, and if the estimates look fishy and look, and they seem to change when the party in power changes, all those things I think would, argue for more transparency. But I think there's a cost to transparency. Another way of saying what I said before, if you've got a model that's worked pretty well for estimating certain provisions, and it would have to be used to estimate a lot more provisions that haven't really been passed into law before, haven't even been considered. The Joint Committee revenue estimator might, again, run it through, say, for estimating this kind of provision, this model doesn't seem quite right. We've made certain assumptions which are innocuous for what we've done in the past, but for this, we kind of have to modify the model. All legitimate learning process. But again, if you say, here's a particular type of tax, here's the model out there, and this is the model we're going to use, and we're not going to make any changes to it. Well, I think then you have the problem of reverse engineering, which is that you just keep trying different proposals with different combinations of changes. And sooner or later, you're going to come up with one for which the model isn't really well suited. And then you're going to go to the Joint Committee staff and say, sorry, you can't change your revenue estimate. You've made your information, your model is in the public domain, and we just used it, and that's the revenue score we expect you to give us. And I don't think that's the right way to do things. Now, again, I said if this were an apolitical process, that wouldn't be a problem, because then the Joint Committee would say, well, that you've uncovered a glitch in our estimating process, which we would have come up with ourselves probably if we'd been asked to estimate this proposal, we would have fixed it. But now we can't do that, and if we do, you'll say that we're working for your political opponents. So I think it's a complicated issue, and simply saying that things should be open source or in the public domain assumes that you know what the right answer is, and your view of what the right answer is never going to change, and you're never going to learn from the estimating process. And I just don't think that's realistic, and it does come with a cost of apparent lack of transparency and all that, and I think there's an intermediate step that the Joint Committee staff can take and does take in giving people, this is the procedure by which, this is the process by which we produce revenue estimates. And here are some of the estimates we've just produced. And David, you mentioned the conference at Brookings a little over a year ago where there were Joint Committee and Congressional Budget Office estimates of some dynamic scoring, and it was a perfectly good discussion, and I don't think anybody was defensive about it because it was something that people understood was difficult to do. But when it has to be part of the process and the number really matters for the process, I think the best way to go about it is a little subtle.
So I think there are trade-offs, and Alan outlined them, and the question is getting the balance right. Obviously, I think it's a bit of a red herring to say, well, if we are going to say we only use this model, I mean, nobody should believe that, and they can explain that. The Federal Reserve makes the FERBUS model public, and sometimes people say, well, FERBUS says you should do this, but the Fed has been pretty clear that that's one input in their decision-making. I just think it's a question of trade-offs. How much transparency do you need to maintain your credibility and independence before you start letting people re-engineer? I'm not sure what the right balance is. I think it's probably a little bit more transparency than we have now.
Great. Before we wrap, I understand we have at least 3 former chiefs of staff in the room. If you don't mind just waving, standing up when Ron Perlman is here. So you can stand up and wave so everyone sees you. George Yin is here. And Hank Gutman is here. And I know And Ken Keyes was actually sat through an entire hearing in Longworth this morning, so he's been in the complex, but not in the room right now. Well, thank you, to Tom, for organizing this, and thank our panel here for some really interesting perspectives on all facets of JCT, and we'll see you in 21-26.